along the north shore of Lake Superior near Duluth. That's where I live and work now. I like the quiet pace of life here, where I can do my art. Well, I was raised in Ely on a farm 10 miles south of town, out in the country. Horses, pigs, cows, big gardens, potato patches. My dad was Ojibwe and my mother was Finnish. And my mother was a second-generation Finnish immigrant who went to normal school and became a teacher. My father went to the Vermilion boarding school in about 1918. And my mother was a school teacher at the day school on the reservation in the late 1920s. And so that's where they met. My folks were living at the Vermilion Indian Reservation at the time that I was born. And about 2 or 3 years later, we moved to Ely. And the place that we moved to Ely had a lot of roots from my family, because that was my mother's farm, and that's where she grew up. So she inherited, and that's where I ended up going through high school. And I considered that my home. Growing up on a Finnish farm with the Finnish cabins and the Finnish architecture and the Finnish tradition that all went with that, I did a lot of painting of that. And I have the Finnish farm families I'd say about a third of my work is Finnish. We had a farm, so that meant we had huge gardens and we canned most of our own produce. We had milk cows, so we drank our own milk. My father was a seasonal laborer in the woods, and he did a lot of work in the woods on our place. So we did just about everything that is now thought of as traditional sustenance activities. My father trapped. Hunting was a big part of our family. 2 trapping seasons was always a lot of bustle and activity about that. There were 8 kids in our family, and every once in a while our grandfather stayed with us. So this was in a 3-room house, so I still don't understand how that worked, but it did somehow. My mother said that I was drawing before I could walk. Since I was a child of her old age, she loved it that she just had to give me a piece of paper and pencil, and I was quiet, and I was occupied forever. My mother could draw and paint from her teaching background. She had some courses on it. But no one in my family had any idea what this was all about. And my older siblings kept trying to discourage me from going into art. And they had no idea what it was about or whether it was possible to have a career in it. But I stuck to my guns. I've always known, I knew before I even started school that being an artist was what I was going to do. Well, my parents went ricing every year, and that when I got old enough, I went with them. They put tobacco in the water to give thanks before starting, then pull out into the rice beds. Person sitting down knocks the rice into the boat. When they come in, they put the rice into bags to take home. This is an activity still practiced today at Nett Lake. It's an important tradition of the Ojibwe people there. I have a lot of memories of that. a lot of the scenes that I did of wild racing, with the huge cast iron cooking pot and a lady stirring the rice, that was my mother, and that was the basis for those paintings. There was a lot of places around Ely that we raced, but then we also went to Nett Lake every year. And when I started going to Nett Lake when I was in high school, that's when I started hanging around the red. And a lot of the basis for my paintings as time went on was on that experience on those years, in the late 50s and the early 60s. Went to Ely High School, and I don't think they really knew what to do with me, because all I wanted to do was do art. And they were always kind of worried that all the rest of my subjects were lacking. Well, I started in watercolor in high school, and it looked like watercolor was going to be my area. And I started honing my imagery already in high school with watercolor. And then two artists that I became familiar with very early on was Winslow Homer and his American scene genre painting. And I realized early on that's the kind of painter I wanted to be. And then I was exposed to Patrick Desjardins when I was in high school. And I wasn't too aware about him as an Indian painter. I was just looking at him as an artist who painted Indian scenes. And then after that I went to UMD, and I don't think they knew what to do about me either. I decided to go into teaching because just about everybody in the art department was majoring in education, so I went that route. When I got out of school, I was teaching for a couple of years, and I'd always thought that that would be a good day job for my real occupation, which is going to be art. When I was teaching, I was very frustrated because I was too tired at the end of the day to actually do my own painting. And my own painting at that time was not very compatible with high school students and high school art programs. It was like two different worlds. I'd go from, it was like being a blues musician at sleazy nightclubs, and you were teaching junior high trumpet during the day. That's about what equivalent it was. And so I wanted to do very political art and very powerful art. And the two areas just simply were not compatible. I went to UWS because I thought a master's degree and perhaps college teaching might be a possibility. And then halfway through UWS, I heard about this program at the University of Montana at Missoula. And so I went there. And they specialized there in American Indian art and American Indian art history. And so that's where I made American Indian art my field. In looking back on that experience, I'd have to say that in watercolor I was self-taught. So there's a kind of a balance between going to studio classes and taking courses from professors and then learning how to do watercolor on your own to develop your own style. And I opted to stay with my own style instead of following along with my professor's desires, which was to move into abstract expressionism. In 1978, I taught at the University of Minnesota, and I taught there for 3 years. And then after that, I went to UMD, and I taught there for 6 years. And much later, I taught at the College of St. Scholastica for 12 years. College teaching gave me more time to work on my own art. I was tempted to go to Santa Fe because Indians from all over the country moved to Santa Fe. I made a conscious decision to come back home. And it's, every once in a while, I think about that decision because that was really pivotal in my life, as whether I was going to come back to this part of the country or whether I was going to leave it forever. I think an artist has to find an authentic voice, that there has to be something true in what an artist does and what his work ends up to be. And I don't think painting wild ricing while living in Santa Fe would have been appropriate. And if I wanted to give the Ojibwe an image, I had to do it here. And I couldn't do it someplace else. There's a wonderful word, it's called cadencia, and I was introduced to it through a Spanish language teacher. And in Spanish culture, it means the love of home, but it means more than that. It means the light, it means the nuances of the day, it means the subtle culture, it means folk architecture, it means the weather patterns, it's the flora and fauna. It's all of these things that are almost unspoken when a person is so enmeshed with the landscape, and that one senses these patterns. And that's how I felt I could find my authentic voice, is to go back to the place that I knew the best, the Ojibwe image and Ojibwe art onto the national scene. I had to do it from here. I also realized that Ojibwe people were not very well represented in that world. It was dominated, of course, by the Southwest, by the Pueblo and the Navajo painters, then by the Sioux painters from the Northern Plains. But the Ojibwe people were hardly represented at all. There was no Ojibwe images there. So I wanted to make sure that those images were included in the national scene. And I worked pretty hard at that. I wouldn't say that I was very successful at it, but at least my paintings were there at these national shows. Well, when I was in college, of course, I kept up with all the changes in the art world. And I've just ignored it from that point on. The people who buy my work buy it because in one way or another they identify with the land or the people that I'm showing or the activity that's there. And I can't worry or think about national trends. I like to think that someday the art world's going to catch up with me. I guess my primary source of inspiration is the people who lived here and what they did. Ojibwe people, Finnish people, loggers, miners. These are the people that I painted most of my adult career. That it's just as viable, just as important that their lives be recorded somehow. It's the art of the everyday. These are people not doing ceremonial activities, nor is it visionary. I mean, there are Indian painters that do that, but that's not what I do. I want to make something significant out of Indian ladies skinning muskrats. It's the traditions of the everyday. It's cutting wood, trapping, gardening. Many of the things that I experienced or observed firsthand. In almost every painting I do, I've actually did it, or else I was there and saw it. I was always interested in history, and especially the fur trade, and to go back into time, because the landscapes in the background would be the same. And if I could put these historic scenes in front of the landscapes that I was familiar with, and have voyageurs and fur traders and Indians dressed in the fashions of the time, that would be a part of this whole thing too, that the history was just as important. And even those that are too young to remember some of the things that I'm actually showing, they have a sense that they know what's going on. There's a painting at the Fond du Lac Clinic called It's a Girl, in which there's a baby being born on an island in a wigwam, and the time setting is about the 1920s. And the men are firing guns in the air. And across the lake, see some campfires. That ended up to be the favorite painting of many of the people there. And even though that custom was extant in the 1920s, but certainly is not anymore, but they knew it. It was just great. I mean, they identified with it very closely. It's the art of the everyday. Well, I'm working from 40 years of experience of doing the images, doing Ojibwe images and Ojibwe life and Ojibwe activities. And it's almost just right out of the blue now. I take a lot of my own photographs, like these sunsets and clouds as photographs. They're not very good, but they serve my purpose of being able to have a catalog of sunset skies and sunrise skies and stormy clouds. So all my clouds that I have in my paintings are all from my own photographs. Well, the watercolor paper I lay flat. I wet it down. I start with the area that's furthest back and work my way forward. So the sky is the furthest thing back. I put that in right away. I put that in with a wash. I wet the paper down. And as I'm working, I can kind of control the washes a little bit. I can put clouds down. They'll run a little bit and make them soft focused. But it's all an illusion. I'm doing an illusion of clouds. And so they're basically brush strokes. That's all they are. So the furthest thing that's back is the clouds, and then the reflection goes next. The far horizon goes next. And then whatever figures are going to be standing up against that sky, they go in next. Keep working my way to the foreground until I'm right at the bottom of the picture and I'm putting in grasses and leaves and little tiny details right in the front. I sketch very lightly, and the tradition in watercolor is you're supposed to sketch so light that you can leave in your sketches without having to erase it, and they're hardly noticeable. The eye moves closer to the foreground. There has to be more and more realistic imagery and more finer imagery, or at least brushstrokes that suggest that. So it has to be grasses and leaves and pieces of driftwood and rocks. Yes, this was at Grand Portage. So that's Hat Point over there. And so this is a carrying yoke for carrying water. And she's got 2 birch bark buckets swinging from that carrying yoke. And she's going down to Lake Superior and dipping the water out of the lake. Just at one certain moment, she stands and looks out across to the sky and across to the far horizon. So by her looking out there, we look out there. It's just for a moment, she's kind of frozen by the cloud formations. Or perhaps there's something out in the lake that she's looking at. I can get a lot of real spontaneous effects here. Some things that I don't even plan on that will just happen in watercolor. And I like that lack of control. I like living life on the edge. With acrylic, it's controlled, and you take advantage of that control by trying to control it. There's no control in watercolor. You just start splashing stuff around and it just has a life of its own. It just takes off. Well, I'm kind of excited about the 3-dimensional pieces because they're so new. And I don't know if there's many other people that are doing things that way. But what I've done is taken my painting style and my painting subject and simply put them on a new media, a block of wood. The figures, with their slight 3-dimensional quality, just come alive. They startle me sometimes when I glance them out of the corner of my eye. We're sitting around in the studio here. So they're really exciting. I did do a book on Finnish cartoons, and that was because I had a chance to be a cartoonist for the Finnish American Reporter. So I did a cartoon once a month and put those cartoons together for a Finnish American cartoon book, and that was called In With the Finn Crowd. And that was very fun to do. I wanted to show the kind of humor that Finnish people share with each other, and that in that cartoon book there are Finnish people doing all kinds of different things and interesting things, and being funny about it at the same time. Murals are, for an artist, are, let's see if there's an equivalent in music. It would be as if you were playing in nightclubs and all of a sudden you got a chance to play in Carnegie Hall. So a mural is a permanent record of your art, and it's out there, it's in your face for everyone to see it. It's in a public space, usually. You do a watercolor painting, you'll sell it to someone who hangs it up in their house, and basically it's shut off from the public forever. But a mural is not like that. So a mural is a very, very public space. It's more public than an art opening because people will see it for years and years to come. I like murals because it's got a chance to do my own particular historical view of the North. The Superior murals was the brainchild of Paul Gawboy, librarian. He proposed murals which were the old-fashioned library murals where the whole history of a place would be shown. And we find these in old Carnegie libraries and in post offices around the Midwest. He conceived of a whole series of library panels about the history of Superior, creating a big historical panorama. And that all of those things happened right in Superior, little old Superior. And that you kind of look at Superior and it looks like a typical Midwestern Great Lakes Rust Belt community. But the things that happened there, the Industrial Revolution focused right there, the fur trade happened right there, the labor movement happened right there. The Great Lakes shipping and all the technology, much of it was invented right there in Superior. The war effort, there were ships being made right there in Superior. All these things happened right in Superior. You couldn't ask for a more spectacular history than that. And I was able to show it. Better than a series of black and white photographs, better than a lecture on names and dates. I thought, oh, you just can't beat it. When the Boys Fort Museum asked me to do a mural, they originally wanted to do the founding of Nett Lake. And that was a kind of a spiritual, it was a myth, it was a spiritual legend. And it was partly grounded in real geographic movements of peoples, but also has a kind of a mythic quality to it. The migration, the big myth about Ojibwe people and their migration from the eastern seaboard to the Great Lakes area. And how do you show these mythic events and how do you show people taking part in something that's 100 times bigger than they are and that they are a part of it? So I did real people. I showed them in the type of outfits that they probably wore 500 years ago, 600 years ago, 1,000 years ago. I wanted to show old people, young people, kids, dogs, canoes. And then I wanted to show the allegorical map, which I did in a pictographic style, as if it was a pictograph done in red ochre on a rock or on a birch bark scroll. My goal is to create a visual imagery of myth that other artists could take off with and kind of create a whole genre of illustrating myth. About a third of my work is mythology. This type of work is very hard to do because it's imaginative and there are few visual references to it. This is the Four Hills of Life, the Gifts of the Seven Grandfathers, Nanabuju chasing the otter at the outlet of the St. Louis River. Some paintings I do are historic. They're in an actual setting, but the costuming, the technology is all of the 19th century. This is Morning Chores, Spirit Mountain with Spirit Island in the distance, the scene of Grand Portage from Mount Rose. The scenes that are set in the 1950s are my own personal memories. The wedding at Swan Lake Hall is a painting of some of the rural weddings that I attended when I was hanging around Nett Lake. Rural kids on bicycles in the landscape. Funerals with carrying coffins to the gravesite. Powwow scenes. If people look at my work, I want them to know that I know what I'm talking about. I can create beautiful scenes. I can even paint romantic imagery. But what I'm showing is something that was real, not something just simply made up. And if I was in a trapping camp, for example, which I was, and if I was really digging potatoes, and if I was planting trees or doing this kind of work, that I feel that by painting it, I've not only created a historical record, but I've created the atmosphere and the mood and the context. Very often when there wasn't a camera or a historical document that recorded those activities, that I provided this image where many cases they don't exist. They existed only in my memory, and that when I put them down on paper, then I've created this authentic document. You remember that video that I showed you that came from Net Lake? Every once in a while I look at that video and I use it in class and I think, well, these are the people that I paint for, and these are the people that I do my work for. I felt that all my work, whether it was teaching Indian studies or whether it was painting, was working for them, for those people in that video. And that's why that little video was important, and that's why ultimately I hope that my work will be considered important. It's the art of the everyday.
Some things in life, some things you see.